Dr. Mohammed Mustafa, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You've travelled to Gaza on two medical missions over the
Yep.
last year. You're now back in Australia.
Yeah.
What motivated you to go to Gaza not once but twice, despite the
Yeah.
risks?
Well, I mean, I think you see all over your social media news of children, with missing limbs, heads, people burnt alive, starving, um, and you see the vitriol politically about it all. And I just kept thinking to myself, what about those poor kids? You know, someone needs to help those kids. And I'm a doctor, and we took an oath, and I felt like it was my calling, as a
Mm.
doctor to go over there to one of the worst humanitarian, probably the worst humanitarian situation of the 21st century. And I wanted to be there. I wanted to be there for those people. And I didn't want to let them down. So that's what motivated me to go the first time. And the second time motivated me to go was because I fell in love with Gaza and the people of Gaza when I went the first time. So I had
Mm.
to go back and keep doing what I was doing.
We know that hundreds of aid workers have been killed. Doctors Without
Mhm.
Borders says that, quote, Gaza has been turned into a mass grave of Palestinians and those coming to their assistance. How did you prepare yourself for that?
So it's not easy. I had put all my stuff this time around into a storage unit. I'd sold one of my cars. I gave my keys to my other car to my friend. I gave my financial advisor my dad's phone number
Mm.
because he has access to my bank accounts. I made sure that I messaged everybody before I left and told them that I love them. And I just went in hoping for the best, but expecting the worst, or preparing for the worst, and that's how you go into these things.
So you arrived in Gaza in March. The ceasefire was still holding, although we know that people were still being killed
Yeah,
during that period.
yeah.
Talk to me about what that was like, what you saw when you first got there.
There was like an excitement in the street and a buzz. We would finish our shifts or we would finish working for a period of time, and we would go out into the markets and get some food and try and experience a bit of local cuisine and desserts. And you can see how happy people were. But even during the ceasefire, we were still seeing children with gunshot wounds to the head and neck, single shot wounds to the head and neck. We were still seeing people with explosive injuries from missile and drone attacks. So, we were still seeing, warlike wounds and injuries to people, but it was at a much lower scale than it had been before. And, we felt somewhat partially safe to go out and, experience Gaza. We'd go to the mosque and pray and things like that. And it was Ramadan. So,
Mm.
everyone would have things to eat and food and stuff like that in the evening. So, it was pretty fun. It was fun at the first when it first started. Scary, but, it was enjoyable.
And you were at Al Ahli Baptist Hospital. Talk to me about what the conditions were like there, the conditions that you were working under.
So at the Baptist Hospital, the emergency department is about 5 meters wide and about 15 meters long. There's, about 10 beds in there, but these beds, like, they have broken wheels. They don't even lift up. Some of them don't even have mattresses on them. So it's just a metal, a metal slab.
Mm.
And there's no ventilators. There isn't a thermometer. There is no glucose sticks to measure sugar levels. There's very limited supply. I think we only have like 2 or 3 different types of antibiotics. And, we were very limited. There wasn't even any scissors, when we'd get those events and you'd need scissors to cut through clothes. There wasn't even any of that. So essentially, the little pocket, bag that I bought of my doctor supplies, that pretty much was 50% of the supply of the equipment of that hospital was my little bag.
How did you manage without some of those basics?
You can do a lot in the emergency department with very little. I think sometimes, we get focused on all of our expensive gadgets and all the things that we have in our Western hospitals. But third world countries, they have a lot of people coming to the emergency department with little resources and they get things done.
Mm.
And the focus for me when we'd have mass casualty events is stop the bleeding, make sure they're breathing, and help assist their breathing. So, things like that would be tourniquet, tightening up any limbs that are severed or anything like that to just try and cut off the bleeding, intubating people, if we need to protect their airways from head injuries, and trying to stabilize them. So you can do a lot with very little with that. You just need some sutures, some belts, and a very strong stomach.
Mm. So, Dr. Mo, days after you arrived, the ceasefire was broken by Israel.
Yep.
People who follow you on social media would have seen that you were providing updates on the ground. Talk to me about that moment.
It was actually, honestly, it was one of the most terrifying nights I think we'd ever had. It was terrifying. It was emotional. There was a lot of emotions going on. You know, I'd finished working in the emergency department by 11 o'clock, and I decided, I'll go to bed and I'll come back in the morning and see what's going on, because it's usually quiet at night because people are scared to travel at night. So I was there in my room. I'd just about fallen asleep. I'd literally closed my eyes, and all of a sudden these explosions were heard everywhere at 1:30, and it was so intense that the windows blew off their hinges and I'd fallen out of my bed. We've just woken up. The whole place is shaking. There's been bombs that have been going down for about 30 minutes non-stop. And you just heard screams everywhere, women and children screaming everywhere. And I was in a room with, other international doctors and nurses. And, we all composed ourselves and like, right, all of us need to go down to the emergency department. This sounds bad. And we can hear the sirens going off, so we know that patients are about to come in. So, in the chaos of it all, I just went down in my pajamas, put on my Panzermer jacket and my stethoscope and my doctor bag, and we went down, and, what we saw was just, that night, more children were killed in the first hour and a half than in the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict in 3 years. Just to give you an idea, and most of those dead children came to my hospital. And within about 30 minutes, the whole emergency department was full of women and children. This is Thurla. She came in on that night of the mass casualties. Fortunately, they managed to salvage her arm. The girl in this bed right here is her 14-year-old sister, who has extensive burns all over her body. Again, we do not have the medical equipment and the resources to look after her. Her mother was killed along with her other sister. There was bodies that, were dead, and they were just leaving them outside in the street, because we just didn't have time to move them to the morgue or anything like that. So we were just piling bodies in one corner outside the emergency department. We had bodies inside, and, children with like missing limbs and severed arms and 80% body burns. And there was only 3 doctors that were on that night, that were working in the emergency department, and a handful of nurses. Then when the, international doctors arrived at the emergency department, there was a total of, I think, about maybe 10 doctors, and there was, like 1,000 casualties.
How do you respond to that scale of trauma?
Well, you can't prepare for that at all. There's no security or anything like that at the hospital. So everyone was just coming in and just, literally putting their child into your hand and saying, doctor, see my son, see my child, and the child would have like an open wound and you can see his brain hanging out, and you would have to sometimes, push the child back into his chest and say, I need to, this is not the child that I'm going to save. And that is a 2-second conversation that you have with a parent, and you can imagine the anger that they feel, the pain that they feel, but you have to be ruthless to go and help who you can help, because a child with a, brain out wound, struggling to breathe in a mass casualty event like that is not going to survive, So there's others that can survive, and those what you need to focus on. And because I'd been there before, I was kind of mentally prepared for what I needed to do, but there was no way you could prepare for what we had. The department was so full that it spilled out onto the streets, and we were cutting people's chests open to put in chest drains in the streets of Gaza. We were cutting them open sewers, and then we had to, we were taking people to the CT scanner. There was only one CT scanner, and it's located like 100 meters away from the emergency department in another building. And, those beds are, first of all, they're broken. The wheels don't work. And it's very hard to move people with the beds when there's all these bodies all over the place. So I ended up, just because I was, 6'2" and about 18 stone, I ended up just carrying 2 or 3 people at a time on my back, on my chest, carrying them and just running to the CT scanner to get people in. And You know, there was like a good half-hour period where, I was just now the porter, and I was just moving back and forth, carrying children, women, like whoever. There were so many of them that just bled out and died, and I was covered in blood. It was just very, very difficult. Like it was, you know, having one person die in your arms is hard, but when you have like 20, 30 in the space of an hour of people just bleeding out and you're covered in their blood, yeah, man, it's hard sometimes to process what happened.
Your eyewitness testimony from that night went viral online. You filmed what you saw and you shared it with the world. Did you ever fear for your own safety?
I was told that the organization that I was with had prepared a statement for my death. That's how scared they were that I was going to be targeted and killed. They actually prepared a letter, a press release of my death, and they showed it to me, a couple of days ago, and it really hit home how dangerous the situation was because, when we were there, hospitals were being bombed with international aid workers in the hospital. We then had the UN safe house that was bombed and international aid workers killed. We had the paramedics that were executed and buried in a shallow grave. We had an entire hospital blown up, which was the Turkish cancer hospital, which was destroyed. And then we had, journalists burnt alive in their tents. So this had all happened while we were there.
Mm.
And there was a real risk, and people were really scared, and I was getting threats as well online. People were commenting and saying that I'm, a Hollywood director and I'm just faking all of this stuff, and, that I'm a liar, and, all of these kind of things. And then people were threatening my safety. And obviously I still have work to do. So it was a pretty stressful environment. But I'm here, I survived. I'm back on home soil. It felt good to be home.
Mm.
It really did. When I landed back home, it felt good because there were times when I was there in Gaza that I didn't think I'd be coming back.
You mentioned just there the massacre of Red Crescent paramedics and rescue workers. We have heard numerous and inconsistent claims from Israel about what happened. Their bodies, as you noted, were buried alongside their vehicles. I wonder, Dr. Mo, what your response to that is.
Do you know those Red Crescent workers? Because I've worked with them. When they come and they bring in those bodies, are some of the bravest people and most noble people on this planet. And, I think them and the Palestinian civil defense, those people that go and dig under the rubble to try and retrieve people, they need to win a Nobel Peace Prize. When their sirens go off, they go to the bombings. They drive in, the civil servants, the paramedics, complete disregard, for their own health and well-being and safety just to save lives. They're the real heroes, and that's why when SBS and stuff were asking me and they were going, oh, people calling you a hero. I'm like, honestly, you go to Gaza, there's about 20 Supermans in one street that you walk in. These people are so brave in what they're able to overcome. And knowing, especially hearing that voice note, that call that he said to his mother when he said, "Mother, forgive me, I was only trying to help people." It really resonated with me because I had the same conversation with my mother, when I was there in Gaza. That first night of that bombing when the ceasefire broke, I called up my mum, and obviously there was no signal, so I left a voice note and I said to her, "Please, Mum, if I've ever let you down, forgive me." And hearing him say the same thing, I knew how scared he must have been, and for them to be executed like that and their bodies thrown into a shallow grave and buried with their ambulance, it's a war crime. And there's been so many though of these doctors and nurses and paramedics that have been killed and executed in Gaza. I take my hats off to them for their bravery, for continuing to go on and on and on.
Mm. Israel's most recent explanation for what happened was that, quote, there had been professional failures. What do you think should happen now?
Well, there's what I think should happen now, and then there's what will happen now. What will happen now is nothing, We've seen so many of this, and this is another big point was, Zomi, our very own Zomi, our Australian aid worker from World Central Kitchen who was there feeding children in Gaza, and she was killed as well. And it's been over a year and nothing has happened. And she's Australian, she's not Palestinian. So, if she can't even get justice, how do we expect these paramedics to get justice? And, I've reached out to the family of Zomi and, they've given me their blessing to carry forward her cause. And that's what I'm doing. That's part of the reason why I'm going out here and doing all these interviews and doing all these podcasts, because we need to honor Zomi and what she did. And she was out there trying to feed children in Gaza, and she was killed for feeding children in Gaza. Now, I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're in. I don't care whether you're right wing, left wing, pro-Palestine, pro-Israel. It doesn't matter to me. When one of our own gets killed feeding children, that should be a rally for everyone. And we should turn around and say, if she was feeding children, we should feed more children in her honor. That's what we should do. And I know that's what the family wants. And, if we can't get justice, the least we can do is honor Zomi and honor her legacy. So, she's my hero. And, I'm here fighting for her as well. So it's not just the children of Gaza, it's her as well I'm fighting for. And I have the family's blessing. And that's what I'm going to continue doing.
Mm. Both while you were in Gaza and now since you've returned home, you've done countless interviews and media appearances. Do you feel like your message is being heard by those with the capacity to act, by political leaders?
I think it is. I think it is being heard. I'm getting a lot of messages from a lot of people in very high positions. And I'm meeting with a lot of, politicians. But, it's a very mixed bag of what I'm getting, A lot of people want me to stay in my lane, and play things a certain way. But there are children dying every single day. And I'm not going to sit here and be patient. I'm going to be impatient, and I'm going to make noise until I get that sit down and I get that meeting. I'm not here to attack anyone. I just want to be clear, right? Yeah. Obviously, I'm disappointed in the lack of response in Gaza and what we've done, and we can do more. I've sat down with, Greens, Independents, Labour. I've spoken to a lot of people, a lot of all sides of the spectrum. I know that if our Prime Minister was to turn around today and say, I'm going to do this, this, and this for Gaza, right here. Even if people believe it's not enough, I want to be that olive branch and be like, listen, it's come to a stage where the situation is so dire that anything is better than nothing. If our Prime Minister is brave enough to do something, no matter how little, I think he deserves a pat on the back for that. And I think everyone should come together and support him, because this issue is so divisive. There's journalists that have lost their jobs for this, and there's been legal battles, I'm sure you're aware of. And there's doctors that have the same thing, nurses, all kinds of issues that have arisen from this issue. And I want to take the fire out of the issue, and I want to focus it on the humanitarian side of things. The Prime Minister said that, we're not a major player in the Middle East, right? We don't have to be a major player in the Middle East to feed children. We don't have to be a major player in the Middle East to heal children, to help them. We don't have to be. And what happens is when you feed children and you heal the sick, you become a major player, because for that child and for that family, Australia would have changed their life.
Dr. Mo, I want to ask you about that. In direct response to your plea for Australia to do more, the Prime Minister said that Australia was not a major player. He repeated that on this podcast on Full Story last week. You were still in Gaza at the time, tending to the wounded. When you heard that, what did you think? What is your response?
Zomi wasn't a major player in the Middle East either, but she gave up her life. We don't have to have a big army. We don't have to have big guns to be a major player in the Middle East. These are human beings, and I'm trying to humanize them. And, when the Prime Minister was asked to sit down and talk to me, because there was another reporter that asked him, and he said, I don't know him. We'll take it into consideration. Unlike the other guy, I don't shoot from the hip. I want to say to the Prime Minister, I don't want you to shoot from the hip. I want you to shoot from the heart. I want you to shoot from the heart. These kids, they need help and they need courage. And if Zombie sacrificed her life for those children and I put my life in danger and we're both Australian, then at least sit down with me and talk to me and let's figure out a way to help those children. And this is not going to cost you anything politically. This is a uniting factor. Nobody can say anything. We're saying that we're here to honour a fallen Australian. We're here to feed children. If a certain somebody doesn't like that and wants to criticise you, that just shows you his humanity. But I think this is a time for courage, and people have to be brave. And I thought to myself, I've already risked my life out there in Gaza, putting myself out there and traveling around the country. I'm doing this all off my own back. I sold my car. I've put all my stuff in a storage unit. I gave up the lease to my apartment. I'm literally living out in my suitcase, and I'm traveling around the country doing this on my own dime. I don't even know how I'm going to pay, the phone bill at the end of the month. But what I do know is if we get something for those children in Gaza, it'll be worth it, because too many of them died that night in my arms, and too many of them died asking me for help, and I couldn't help them. And that's why I'm doing this.
You're urging the Australian government to do more. You've also called on the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to meet with you directly to talk about medical aid and what medical aid can be provided to the Palestinians in Gaza. Have you had a response?
I've had advisors reach out to me saying they want to organise a meeting, but there's been no response since then. We've tried to call, and we've not heard much back. So I'll try again. I'll reach out again. I want to sit down with the Foreign Minister, and I want to sit down with the Prime Minister, right? Because this is not just a foreign minister issue. This is a national issue as well. We are seeing the rise of Islamophobia. We're seeing the rise of anti-Semitism in this country, and we need to bring the fever pitch down in this country. And in order to do that, we need both of them to work together to, one, reduce the temperature down there in Gaza by helping feed the people there and help the children. And two, we need to bring it down here where we can see each other's humanity again. We can all agree that helping the children is okay, and it's something that we want. We can all agree on freeing the hostages. We can all agree on these things. They shouldn't be political dividing issues, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to bring down the fever pitch, but I need my Prime Minister to work with me on this one. I feel like since being given the blessing of Zombie's family and going over there to Gaza twice, being Muslim, I've been cast into this spotlight, and I've got this momentum behind me. I've got a lot of support from a lot of people, and a lot of people from all sides of the political spectrum. Sit down with me. Let's do something that unites the country, right? Let's unite the Muslim community. Let's unite the college campus students. Let's unite the Jewish community. Let's do something where we take out the rhetoric and focus on the humanity. And that's all I'm trying to do.
On Palm Sunday, the Prime Minister condemned a Russian attack on Ukraine which killed and injured civilians. He explicitly called it a gross violation of international law. He's not used the same unequivocal language in relation to Israeli attacks in Gaza, nor has he condemned an Israeli strike on the very hospital that you were volunteering at. What do you make of that starkly different response?
So look, I want to be very, very careful because there's a lane that I'm trying to stay in. I don't want to criticize my Prime Minister, right? Well, I don't want to criticize him too much, but I don't want to criticize him. I need him on my side. I'm not a politician. I'm not a journalist. I'm a doctor. I'm obviously disappointed, that this hospital that Australians worked in was bombed, and it was the only access to healthcare for like 1 million people in Gaza has now been destroyed. I need him on my side. When I was there in June, I was there when the IDF had rescued those 4 hostages. And that night there was over 1,000 just from that rescue operation. I think 1,400 killed and injured in 2 hours in that rescue operation. And they all came to my hospital. I mean, imagine that mass casualty event, what it was like. We were picking up hands, ears, someone's nose, someone's head, and we were just putting it in a room filled with body parts because of just the amount of dead that we'd seen. And, I remember thinking to myself, feeling a sigh of relief, for those hostages that were rescued. But at the same time, I thought, what about all these women and children who have been killed? What about them? What about the fact that, there's 2 million people in Gaza right now who have been cut off from food, water, electricity, which is illegal under international law, collective punishment? Are they not hostages as well? The framing is very important, right? Because what people feel most angry about, and the reason why you see people so passionately on the streets protesting and things reaching a fever point, is because we're not honest about the framing. And we need to be honest. We need to call a spade, and we need to say it what it is. When you bomb a hospital, that's wrong. Whether that hospital is full of brown children or white children, it's wrong. When you cut off food, water, and electricity, that's wrong. I remember when I was there, people were, because I didn't have, I had other people that had access to my social media, but, they were reading messages of people going, he's an actor. He's just there acting. This is all fake. And I remember just thinking to myself, like, if we can't even agree that these children are dying, how can we agree to solve the problem? And that's why it's really important that I sit down with the Prime Minister and talk with him, because what I want to do is I want us to at least establish and say, hey, listen, as Australians, we all can agree on basic humanitarian principles, which is children shouldn't be starving to death. They shouldn't be starving to death, and they shouldn't be burnt alive in their tents, and they shouldn't be freezing to death in the cold. Those are things we can all agree on. And if we can just say that, I guarantee you it will bring down the fever pitch. And it will, because the Muslim community feels abandoned, when we have, 1 million children in Gaza starving to death and being burnt and bombed to death. If we can't even talk about that honestly, the Muslim community loses trust. I just want to have a human moment with him, and I want to help him.
What
You know
would,
what I mean?
what would you want the outcome of that meeting to be?
There's a lot of ideas that I have of what we need in Gaza. I don't want to say specifics of what I exactly want because I understand how politics work. So I want to leave that room for negotiation with him. But there's a lot that we can do. Just put it into perspective. There isn't even a thermometer at the hospital that I was in, right? So we can go from thermometer to hospital to a whole hospital. We got a full range of things that we can do. There's a lot of scope for what we can do to feed people, what we can do to heal people. There's so much that we can do, but I just want him to listen to me and other aid workers, not just me. I've got other colleagues, that I went there with that are Australian, Bushra, Jeremy. These people have been on 2 missions as well, like myself, that have been to Gaza, and they're both consultants. I'm an emergency physician trainee, so I'm not a consultant yet. I'm still training, but they're consultants. They're the big bosses. Sit down and talk to me. Sit down, talk to them. I understand the language over there. I've talked to the people over there, and also as well think about the Lebanese community here in Australia, how much they've been affected by this as well. They've seen their homes and their families being killed and destroyed in Lebanon as well. And the conflict is only expanding by the looks of things.
For those of us, Dr. Mo, who've been watching Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza through our phones and at a distance, it is unbearable to watch. How do you settle back into life here after witnessing what you've seen up close?
Well, I haven't really. I haven't stopped. I've been on the campaign trail since I've arrived. I'm doing all the media that I can. I'm trying to talk. Look, I'm not a politician. I've never had any media training. Don't have a whole team behind me telling me what to do and what not to do. I've got Matu, who is probably the most amazing human being I've probably ever met. And he's a nurse out here in Melbourne. And, he's the one that reached out to me months ago. And he's, when I arrived here in Melbourne, he'd put food in the fridge for me. He prints off my schedule every single day. He helps go through the social media and all the interview requests and the people reaching out to me and things like that. And it's just me and him. It's a doctor and a nurse. I mean, that's it. It's just one doctor and his nurse, going out there trying to make a difference because we're healthcare workers and we took an oath. And he takes that very seriously and I take that very seriously. And, behind every great doctor is an even greater nurse. So that, if it wasn't, if I didn't have him behind me, I don't think I'd be able to cope with all the with everything going on. But it's hard some days. It really is hard some days, and you know, when I have the quiet moments alone, sometimes yeah, it can get a bit too much. But I try and focus on the mission, and the mission is to help those children.
You're spreading the message here. Do you have plans to go back?
I want to. I don't know if I'll be allowed back in because of the profile that I'm beginning to gain. If they said to me tomorrow you can go back in, even with all the risks and everything else, I wouldn't skip a heartbeat. I would do it. I would go back in. I miss Gaza so much. I miss the people there, how brave they are, how resilient they are, their kindness towards me. Um, I would have the nurses at the hospital. They would. We'd sleep in the doctor quarters and they would sleep in a room downstairs. But they would always come to my room in the morning and they would take my, dirty laundry and they'd hand wash it for me, you know, and they would say, it's the least we can do. You've risked your life coming over here to Gaza. The least we can do is cook for you and give you some and clean your clothes for you. And I remember just saying to myself, like, I've come here to serve you guys, not the other way around. Do you know what I mean? They're just so kind. And yeah, I want to go back. Whether I'll be allowed to go back is another thing. But yeah, I really just hope the war stops soon. The killing stops.
Dr. Mo, thank you so much for the work you do and for speaking to Full Story.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.